It's the middle of the night over Crimea. The sky is quiet, too quiet. Russian soldiers are smoking, scrolling their phones, leaning against armored vehicles parked in neat, confident rows. This is supposed to be safe territory, deep rear, untouchable. And then, the first explosion hits. Not one, not two. A chain reaction. Fuel depots ignite like matchsticks. Ammunition dumps erupt into the air, sending shockwaves across the peninsula. Jets scramble, but they don't take off. They burn where they stand. Soldiers run, but there is nowhere to run. The ground itself feels like it's tearing open beneath them. And here's the part that makes no sense. There are no incoming missiles on radar. No warning, no interception, no defense. Just precision destruction. Silent, surgical, relentless. Within minutes, one of Russia's most fortified rear positions is no longer a base. It's a graveyard. But here's the twist. The explosions don't stop in Crimea. They spread. Not physically, but systematically. Days later, reports begin to emerge. Russian units across multiple fronts are collapsing faster than expected. Casualty numbers spike. Reinforcements arrive and disappear just as quickly. The second twist? This wasn't just an attack, it was a signal. A signal that something inside the Russian war machine is starting to break. This is not a scene from a movie. This is not a rumor. This actually happened. Crimea, August 2022. What you just witnessed is one of the clearest signals that this war is no longer behaving like a conventional conflict. It is beginning to show the signs of something far more dangerous for Moscow, a system turning on itself. Because this wasn't just about explosions in Crimea, this was about cascading failures, air defense that cannot detect, logistics that cannot protect, command structures that cannot respond in time, each layer weak, dependent, and exposed. And when one layer fails, the others don't compensate, they collapse. That's how systems break, not all at once, but piece by piece, quietly, then suddenly. And now those failures are no longer contained to one peninsula. They are spreading across the battlefield. Today on World Brief Daily, we are going to break down exactly what happened and what it means for the future of this conflict. Stories like this move fast, faster than headlines, faster than official statements, and often faster than the truth itself. So if you want real-time breakdowns that go beyond the surface, make sure you subscribe to World Brief Daily and turn on the bell icon. The first wave of explosions in Crimea began on August 9, 2022, when a series of blasts ripped through the Russian-controlled Saki air base near Novofedorivka. According to Reuters, Aug 10, 2022, and later analysis by Ukrainska Pravda, at least 9 Russian aircraft were destroyed or heavily damaged, including Su-30SM fighter jets and Su-24 bombers. Satellite imagery confirmed multiple crater points across the runway and adjacent ammunition storage zones. Russia initially claimed it was an accidental detonation of stored munitions. However, Western defense analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, rejected that explanation, noting the pattern of simultaneous secondary explosions suggested coordinated targeting rather than internal failure. Just days later, on August 16, 2022, additional explosions struck the Jankoy military facility in northern Crimea, damaging rail infrastructure and ammunition depots. Newsweek reported that Ukrainian officials indirectly hinted at long-range strike capability reaching deep logistical nodes. Then came a critical escalation on August 18, 2022, when Carnegie Endowment analysis highlighted that Crimea had shifted from a rear logistics sanctuary into an active contested battle space. What changed wasn't just geography, it was operational security. Russian forces were forced to relocate aircraft, redistribute air defense systems, and reroute supply chains deeper into mainland Russia, creating longer logistical chains and slower response times. The loss of multiple aircraft, ammunition depots, and radar-linked infrastructure did not immediately shift frontline territory, but it exposed something far more serious. Russia's rear zones were no longer secure. The loss of these assets will not swing the strategic balance, but the story of how they were lost tells us something enormous. Let's start with the facts on the ground. The first wave of explosions in Crimea began on August 9, 2022, when a series of blasts ripped through the Russian-controlled Saki airbase near Novofedorivka. According to Reuters, Aug 10, 2022, and later analysis by Ukrainska Pravda, at least 9 Russian aircraft were destroyed or heavily damaged, including Su-30SM fighter jets and Su-24 bombers. Satellite imagery confirmed multiple crater points across the runway and adjacent ammunition storage zones. Russia initially claimed it was an accidental detonation of stored munitions. However, Western defense analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, rejected that explanation, noting the pattern of simultaneous secondary explosions suggested coordinated targeting rather than internal failure. Just days later, on August 16, 2022, additional explosions struck the Jankoy military facility in northern Crimea, damaging rail infrastructure and ammunition depots. Newsweek reported that Ukrainian officials indirectly hinted at long-range strike capability reaching deep logistical nodes. Then came a critical escalation on August 18, 2022, when Carnegie Endowment analysis highlighted that Crimea had shifted from a rear logistics sanctuary into an active contested battle space. What changed wasn't just geography, it was operational security. Russian forces were forced to relocate aircraft, redistribute air defense systems, and reroute supply chains deeper into mainland Russia, creating longer logistical chains and slower response times. The loss of multiple aircraft, ammunition depots, and radar-linked infrastructure did not immediately shift frontline territory, but it exposed something far more serious. Russia's rear zones were no longer secure. The loss of these assets will not swing the strategic balance, but the story of how they were lost tells us something enormous. To understand what Crimea's explosions actually triggered, you have to zoom out from individual blasts and look at the scale of Russia's broader war losses. By late 2022, according to the Ukrainian General Staff daily updates and aggregated analysis from The Economist 2023 tracking dataset, Russian forces were already sustaining estimated losses of hundreds of troops per day in active combat zones. By mid-2023, Western intelligence estimates, cited by Newsweek and U.S. Defense Department briefings, placed cumulative Russian casualties, killed and wounded, at well over 300,000. Now think about what that actually means. At a conservative battlefield replacement rate, Russia would need to cycle in tens of thousands of new soldiers every month just to maintain frontline stability. That is not expansion. That is maintenance of collapse. Equipment tells an even sharper story. Open source tracking by Oryx, Visual Confirmed Losses Database, recorded thousands of destroyed Russian tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery systems. Even if you assume undercounting, the replacement rate becomes mathematically unsustainable under sanctions constraints. Think about what this actually means. If Russia loses even 100 armored vehicles per week, and domestic production plus imports cannot match that rate, then every month the gap widens, not linearly, exponentially, because older equipment is pulled from storage, repaired, degraded, and sent back weaker than before. Now the impossibility math, if Russia sustained an average net loss of even 1,000 personnel per day over a prolonged period, that equals 365,000 troops per year. Over 3 years, you approach 1 million casualties, a scale of attrition comparable to major 20th century industrial wars, but without equivalent population mobilization capacity or economic flexibility. And here is the structural problem. Russia does not have infinite manpower depth, and it does not have infinite industrial elasticity under sanctions pressure. It is forced into a cycle of substitution, older equipment, rush training, reduced readiness. Russia does not have 10 years of replacement capacity, and it does not have unlimited trained personnel to sacrifice at this rate. Before we go deeper into how this system is actually breaking under its own weight, make sure you are subscribed to World Brief Daily and have notifications turned on, because what comes next is not just about numbers. It's about the hidden logic behind those numbers that most coverage completely misses. Let's keep going. Here's where it gets into territory that Russia's own propagandists cannot easily explain away. Because Russia does not operate like a decentralized Western military structure built around distributed command, layered autonomy, and rapid field adaptation. Instead, it relies on a heavily centralized system, where logistics, targeting approval, and operational coordination often pass through narrow command bottlenecks. In theory, centralization allows control. In practice, it creates fragility. What looks like strength on paper becomes delay in reality. Orders travel upward, approval travels downward, and by the time execution happens, the battlefield has already changed. This is where cascading failure begins. When Ukrainian strike capabilities began targeting logistics hubs, ammunition depots, and command-linked infrastructure in Crimea and occupied territories, Russia's response was not immediate structural adaptation. It was redistribution, moving assets farther back, extending supply chains, and increasing dependency on fewer, more vulnerable corridors. That shift created a paradox. The more Russia tried to protect its assets, the more stretched and exposed its logistics became. Unlike Western-style modular supply systems, where redundancy absorbs shocks, Russia's system concentrates risk. Fuel, ammunition, repair facilities, and air defense coordination often cluster around predictable nodes. Once those nodes are identified, pressure does not need to be constant. It only needs to be precise. And this is where the cascade becomes visible. One depot hit forces relocation. Relocation increases distance. Distance increases fuel demand. Fuel demand increases convoy exposure. Convoy exposure increases losses. Losses force further centralization of remaining assets. Each layer amplifies the next. And Ukraine has learned to exploit exactly this vulnerability, not by matching Russia tank for tank, but by targeting the system that moves the tanks, supplies them, and keeps them operational. This is not about isolated strikes anymore. It is about structural disruption. And Russia's command model, designed for control, is increasingly producing delay, bottleneck, and systemic exposure under sustained pressure. This pattern is not new. Militaries that rely on rigid centralization and overstretched logistics have faced the same structural breakdown before, and the outcomes are remarkably consistent. Go back to 1941, during Operation Barbarossa. The Soviet Union, despite massive manpower reserves, suffered catastrophic early losses, not only because of battlefield defeats, but because of logistical paralysis. According to David Glantz, U.S. military historian and Soviet warfare expert, entire Soviet formations collapsed in the opening months because fuel, communications, and command coordination failed faster than units could retreat or reorganize. The system didn't just lose battles, it lost coherence. Now fast forward to Afghanistan, 1979-1989. Soviet forces once again faced an enemy that did not need to match them symmetrically. Mujahideen forces targeted supply routes, ambush points, and logistical corridors. As documented in Foreign Affairs archives, late Cold War analysis, the decisive factor was not battlefield superiority, but the constant erosion of Soviet operational sustainability. Convoys became liabilities, distance became exhaustion, control became delay. One senior Soviet officer, quoted in post-war analysis by the CIA's Soviet military power assessments, admitted the core failure bluntly: we could hold ground, but we could not hold supply. That sentence defines the structural limit of centralized war systems under persistent asymmetric pressure, and the pattern repeats. When logistics are stretched, when command is centralized, when adaptation is slow, and when the opponent targets infrastructure instead of front lines, collapse does not arrive as a single event. It arrives as accumulation. Small failures compound. Minor delays become systemic friction. Friction becomes attrition. The pattern is consistent and it is accelerating. On September 2022, in the Kherson direction of the Southern Front, a 19-year-old Russian conscript named Ivan Vorobyov was deployed with minimal training, according to reporting compiled by BBC Monitoring and Ukrainian field documentation shared through regional press briefings. He was not part of an elite unit, not a volunteer. He was part of the rapid manpower replenishment cycle that followed early battlefield losses. Vorobyov's unit was assigned to hold a logistics-adjacent defensive position, a role that sounds strategic on paper, but in reality meant exposure, constant movement, unstable supply, limited artillery support. Within days, the unit began reporting equipment shortages, radios failed, ammunition arrived late, evacuation orders were delayed or never transmitted at all. Then came the strike cycle. Ukrainian artillery and precision strikes targeted the surrounding supply routes, not the soldiers directly, but everything that kept them alive. And that's where the system revealed itself. Because when logistics breaks, frontline positions do not retreat in order, they unravel. Vorobyov was later reported missing in action, with unofficial Russian regional listings marking him as presumed killed in combat weeks later. No official confirmation followed. But what matters here is not just one name. This is what the system does at scale. It places inexperienced soldiers into positions designed for sustained logistics support. Then it removes the logistics. Then it expects endurance to replace structure. This is not just one man's story. This is what the system does to people when supply chains become more fragile than the soldiers themselves. And in that gap between expectation and reality, the collapse becomes human. And so we arrive at the place where all of these threads converge: the Crimea explosions, the destroyed air bases, the shattered ammunition depots, the rising casualty rates, the logistics stretch, the centralized command delays, the historical echoes of Soviet attrition, the individual stories like Ivan Vorobyov. They are not separate events. They are one system expressing stress under sustained pressure. Because when you line it all up, a clear structure emerges. Russia is not facing isolated battlefield setbacks. It is facing a feedback loop where each response creates the conditions for the next failure. To reinforce positions, supply lines are extended. To protect assets, depots are dispersed. To reduce vulnerability, command becomes more centralized, and each of those decisions, in turn, increases delay, exposure, and inefficiency. That is what a structural trap looks like. Now return to the impossibility math from earlier. Even at conservative estimates, hundreds of losses per day, thousands of vehicles destroyed over time, replacement rates constrained by sanctions and production limits, the system is not scaling to match its attrition curve. It is bending under it. Russia wanted rapid victory. It got prolonged attrition. Russia wanted strategic depth. It got logistical exhaustion. Russia wanted control of escalation. It got distributed vulnerability. That is not a sequence of setbacks. That is inversion. And here is the deeper truth beneath it all. Wars of this scale are not decided only by who strikes harder, but by who can sustain structure longer under pressure. When structure begins to fail faster than it can be repaired, outcomes stop being tactical. They become mathematical. And the math here is not ambiguous. It is cumulative, accelerating, and increasingly difficult to reverse. The real question is no longer what happens next at the front line, but how long the system can continue to absorb its own losses before adaptation becomes impossible. It started with those Crimea blasts, sudden, coordinated, and impossible to ignore. At first, it looked like just another isolated escalation in a long war. But now, with everything laid out, the logistics strain, the rising casualties, the command bottlenecks, and the historical echoes, that moment looks less like an incident and more like a warning flare. The history books will not remember it as a single night of explosions. They will record it as part of a larger shift, the point where pressure stopped being localized and started becoming systemic. Long after the headlines fade, the consequences of this kind of attrition will remain, still stretching supply lines, still draining manpower, still forcing decisions that only narrow the gap between control and collapse. And that is the real legacy of this phase of the war. Not a single battle, not a single front, but a slow, grinding test of endurance against structure itself, still adapting under pressure, still absorbing losses, still trying to maintain coherence in a system designed for speed, but forced into exhaustion. If you want to stay ahead of how this conflict actually develops, not just the headlines, but the underlying shifts, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. And now the question is this: is Russia adapting fast enough to reverse this trajectory, or has the system already moved beyond the point where adaptation matters? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read them. We want to know what you think. Share this with someone who still believes the surface story, because the deeper picture is very different. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.